Everyone, to the Roundtable in honor of John Merriman. We're so thrilled that you're here. We're so thrilled to have so many people who are eager to be part of this roundtable. My name is Chrastil, and Miranda, Sachs, and I co-organized this event, and we're really excited to have it, as well as the research panel in honor of John that will be happening later on this afternoon. We're going to proceed very, pretty through this long number of people here, and I want to also welcome Laura Merriman and Chris Merriman, who are here joining John as well. We'll just go in alphabetical order according to the program. We'll just briefly introduce everyone, and we'll ask each presenter to keep to 4 minutes so that we'll have time for the audience and for further conversation. One of the first stories that I remember from John Merriman took place in an early seminar where he mentioned that Richard Cobb would sometimes take his false teeth out and kind of make a chattering like thing when people were going on too long, so please don't make me do that. And with that, I'll hand things over to Elinor Accampo from USC.
Thank you. This is going to be like speed dating, I'm afraid. I first met John in the summer of 1975 when he was an assistant professor at Yale, and that was quite an encounter because I'd never met a professor from Yale before, and I didn't know whether John was typical. I was a graduate student at Berkeley, and I was starting my dissertation research. And my meeting with John was the beginning of a 45-year friendship, which has meant more than I can obviously say in 4 minutes. But it was also the beginning of a mentoring relationship that we had that was extremely important. I was trying to do history from the ground up, and I was using the methodology of the social sciencey methodology of demographic history. John understood better than my mentors back in Berkeley what I was trying to accomplish because he had been a student of Charles Tilly. And as the years passed, he became all the more important to me because while I was finishing my dissertation research, my advisor in Berkeley left academia, and John became a kind of de facto advisor to me, where he read my dissertation, wrote letters of recommendation, helped me get 3 successive jobs, helped me guide me through the hoops of tenure and promotion. And I don't know if I could have had this career without his help, for which I will be eternally grateful, as well as I'm grateful for his friendship. Now, there are 2 things that 2 memories I have that I'd like to share. And one of them is that early in our friendship, he said that he wanted to combine the approaches of Charles Tilly and Richard Cobb. And I've been thinking about that a lot. As we all know, John is a brilliant writer, lecturer of undergraduate lectures, and he's written a wonderful textbook, and he has this uncanny ability to combine the broader vision of big movements like Tilly with amazing anecdotes that punctuate his sentences and become punchlines, stories of people. So I looked up a couple of quotes about Cobb, which John once gave me the opportunity to meet Cobb, and I love your story, and that's a whole other story of my meeting with Cobb. But I looked up some quotes, and Cobb was described as approaching history from below, literally from the ground, writing, speaking, thinking like a street urchin, reflecting an intense identification with people who experience rather than make history. And John, to me, is like a street urchin, except that he also not only studies people and writes about people who experience history, but who make history as well. And then another quote: "Few can enjoy the felicity of becoming so soaked in a society not of his by birth, that he moves without needing to look where he is placing his feet among the nuances, its customs, and its silences." John is one of those very few people who enjoys that felicity. And that quote reminds me of the second memory I have of John, a very vivid one that has been with me for 40 years. And that is once when we were leaving the Paris metro. He was typically walking 10 feet ahead of me. He took his metro ticket, crumpled it up in his right hand, flung his hand behind his back, threw it in the trash receptacle on his left without looking, without turning back to see if he had made it. I saw him make it. And it was like dunking a basketball. And that to me is a metaphor of John, a metaphor also described here of moving without needing to look, where he is placing his feet among the nuances and customs and silences. And that is John always hitting the target. Thank you.
So our next speaker is David Bell, who is chaired professor at Princeton.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Miranda and Rachel for organizing all this wonderful panel. So this panel is composed above all of John's former students, and of course there are also a lot of his friends. I think I'm the only one who has been John's colleague at Yale, and may say something about the Yale History Department, alas. So I'd like to talk about being his very junior colleague there. Now, I first met John in February of 1990 when I went to New Haven to interview for a job. And I remember it very vividly. He picked me up at the New Haven train station. He bundled me into his car and drove me to campus. And two things struck me immediately during that car ride. First, simply his energy. He was talking, as always, at a very rapid clip. He was saying how wonderful Yale was. He was telling me about his research. He was asking me about my own experiences in the archives. And then, secondly, his absolute egalitarianism and generosity. Because here he was, an ultra-famous, well-established historian and professor at one of the great universities of the world. I was a completely unknown graduate student whom he'd never met, and he was talking to me as an equal. He was asking me my opinion about things. He was saying indiscreet things about some of his colleagues. And this was all during the car ride to campus, which, as you may know, takes about 7 minutes. So long story short, I got the job, and I became John's junior colleague, and I was his junior colleague for several years. And frankly, I don't know what I would have done without him. Yale in those days could be a pretty stuffy, hierarchical place. Maybe it is still. It was not easy for junior faculty in the history department. There was a famous Yale historian whom I met at a conference a few years after I had left Yale and moved to Johns Hopkins. He and I had a nice chat, and at the end he politely asked my name again. And I wanted to scream at him, "You should really know who I am, because I had the office across the hall from you for 3 years." But I had been a lowly assistant professor, not really worth meeting. Thankfully, not all the colleagues were like that. Of course, there were wonderful colleagues like Peter Gay, Robin Winks, Linda Colley, David Marshall, quite a few others, and they were all lovely and supportive. But John was really in a class by himself. He never stopped treating junior colleagues as equals. He never once said a single unkind or unthoughtful thing. He was always exactly the same hurricane of energy that he'd always been during that initial car ride, always excited about something and always eager to share it. And if you put the energy and generosity together, you get a quality that I would call passionate devotion. And John Merriman is a man of passionate devotions. We all know the list. His family, first and foremost, Carol, Laura, Christopher, his friends, his students, the University of Michigan, and especially its football team, which sometimes actually I think comes at the top of the list, the village of Balazuc, Branford College at Yale, and finally, a very lovely collection of 19th century French men and women who struggled for social justice, often against terrible odds, sometimes in a somewhat misguided way, often at the expense of their own lives. Demoxoc during the agony of the Republic, workers in Limoges, Émile Henry throwing his bomb in Café Terminus, the Communards, many others. The passionate devotion John has to these people, or to most of them, breathed through his work. It brings it to life. And that was, of course, the other really great thing about having John as a colleague. He was simply such an inspiration. He could not wait to dive back into the archives, to find out everything he possibly could about these people, and to write about them. Now, to be honest, I really didn't mind that much leaving the Yale History Department. I was very glad to miss going through the peculiarly sadistic tenure process that they had there at the time, but there were people I really missed, and especially John Merriman. And as I get older and have started mentoring junior colleagues myself, I always try to remember his example and to try to be as supportive and generous as possible, and very briefly, not an asshole. I wish there were more that I could do to thank John, but I think this is a profession where, for the most part, we pay our debts forward. John had many debts to Charles Tilley for all of his incredible support, and John has paid that forward by doing the same for his own many students and younger colleagues, and I know he's inspired us all to do the same thing. So thank you, John.
Yeah, actually, just in the interest of not moving this back and forth, let me introduce Judy Coffin, and then we'll go back to Rachel Chrastil. Or do you want to? Okay, I thought that's what you were saying to me.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump the queue. Thank you for putting this together, and thank you for, I'm very grateful to you for giving me an opportunity to thank John for his mentorship, and above all, his incredible hospitality over many, many decades. He really rolled out the welcome mat to French history and inspired in his students a kind of a passion that we hoped would match his. It was a very egalitarian culture. It was a culture that thrived on solidarity, and it stuck with us all for a long time. I also want to be a little bit sentimental and remember Carol, because I'm old enough to have remembered when Carol came on the scene. And we used to meet in our seminars would meet in, I think it was the benighted Calhoun College, wasn't it, John? Wasn't that? Yeah, you were in right now, now renamed, fortunately renamed Calhoun College, and we would go into his living room, and one Monday, I guess it was, there was no sign of Carol, but at the same time, there were marks of her presence everywhere. John was happy. Food had been cooked there over the weekend. I was in charge of discussion that day, and I think I was supposed to get everybody to talk about La République au village, which was kind of a tough thing if you were a first-year graduate student. I'm not sure I understood anything of it, but John was beaming, and there were women's clothes sort of lying around in the living room. And my friend Michael Burns just discreetly took some of these women's garments and tucked them under the sofa, and we all tried to be discreet and indiscreet at the same time. But anyway, this is thanks that we never got to give to Carol for taking all of us in, to Carol as well as John, for taking all of us in, and to thank their wonderful kids for making us part of the family.
Getting a workout. Okay, here we have Rachel Chrastil.
Thank you. So I'm just going to say a few words about what it's like to start off as a graduate student with John Merriman also, because I started 20 years ago this fall at Yale, and I come straight through from Indiana University. And just to echo some of the same sort of themes of welcome that John does for everyone, as many people feel when they start graduate school, they feel like they're jumping on a train that has been going by for 200 years, and suddenly they've just got to catch it. And that was definitely my experience. I had no idea what was going on. I hadn't read the same books that my colleagues had read, and all of them for some reason had gone to Princeton, and so I was like they all knew the same authors, and so it took me, and I was coming from Indiana University, and I was feeling like, am I in the right place? And I mentioned this at one point over lunch. I think it was at that Thai place to you, John. And you could have said, no, it's all fine or whatever. But instead you said, I don't even know what you're talking about. So that was kind of the attitude, because it wasn't like, it was like that wasn't even a thing in his eyes that we were from different places and had different backgrounds. And that was really, at the time, I wasn't sure what to make of that, but in retrospect, I think it was really precious. I also want to mention, has anyone ever looked at those PhD trees that you see online, those genealogies, right? And if you look at John and you look back and there's Charles Tilly, and then it goes to Barrington Moore, and then it explodes backwards to German theologians and chemists and all manner of background. And it's so beautiful to be part of that tree with you, John, and to be with all these people who are part of that common effort. And I want to close by evoking a text that you had us read in that first semester seminar by Charles Tilly, Did the Cake of Custom Break, which was a slog for me to get through. I'll have to admit. Yeah, Jennifer, you were there. We know. But as you might remember, toward the end of our sort of pained conversation as we're trying to come to grips with this article, John, you said, sometimes you have to ask the big questions and you have to answer the big questions. And that has made all the difference. So thank you, John. And now I'll hand this off.
Working in German theology.
Now I'll hand this off to Katherine Dunlop, who is, of course, our host at this conference.
Well, thank you all for coming to Bozeman. What to say about John? I think I just want to echo what Rachel just said, actually, about that family tree. And I wanted to say that, teaching at a public land-grant university here in Montana, where, ordinary people go to college. They mostly don't go to Yale here. They go where they can afford to go to college. And I wanted to say that John has students that he's not even aware of. And this is through his open course classes that he offers online. I've had several students over the last few years who felt like learning was over for them, and they sort of took a chance. They went online, they found John's course. It's available for free. And they found their way back to school. They applied for FAFSA loans. One student in particular, who became one of my first friends actually in Bozeman, who took John's class, Megan Higgins, she told me the story of how she was following John's class online from the small town of Three Forks, Montana. And, she was working as a baker in a store, and she wanted more from life. She wanted to go back to school. And so she took John's class, and she got so, excited by his energy-filled lectures. And she said, this guy's at Yale, he's never going to write me back, but let me look him up online, and let me just write him an email and see if he can send me 2 exams so I can test myself. And she said, this snobby Yale professor will never write me back. Knowing John, within 2 minutes, she received an email with the exams and also my contact information saying, Go to Montana State, go meet with this professor, She's new here, she's just moving out to Montana, help her get a snowsuit, Wonderful woman. She went on to get not only a bachelor's, but a master's degree. She's a head city manager in Memphis, Tennessee. And so I wanted to say that John, made a difference in the lives of ordinary people. He not only studies them in the past, but he cares about them in the present. And this is the lesson that I take from John. So thank you.
I'll just introduce myself. I'm Joe Fronczak. I'm from Princeton. I want to thank Miranda Sachs and Rachel Chrastil for putting this on and for inviting me. It's an honor to take part. And I have to say, every time that I use the word honor, every time I say, oh, it's an honor to do this, it's an honor to do that, I think of John. anytime I've ever asked John for a favor, anytime I've ever asked him to write something for me, read something for me, comment for me on something, his reply has always been the same. He always says he'd be honored. It'd be an honor to do that. I'd be honored. It's my honor. I have to say that honor was not a word that was part of my vocabulary before I met John. It seemed like kind of a stodgy word, even reactionary, kind of something from elite culture. And it just, it struck me as odd that here you had this, egalitarian-minded new lefty in a leather jacket and jeans who would say that something is an honor. It stood out to me. So, it stood out to me. So I remember specifically the first time that I asked John to do me a favor, and he said it would be his honor to do so. It was when I went to ask him to serve on my oral exam committee. And so I went to his office, and I was nervous because I was running late because I couldn't find his office. First of all, it was down in Brantford College, and so first I had to suffer that classic Yale indignity, every graduate student's indignity at Yale, of waiting at the gate of a college for an undergraduate to swipe you in. And just trying to not look creepy there at the gate. And then trying to decide when the undergraduate comes, do you explain why, or how do you get in the gate without, again, just seeming obnoxiously creepy? So finally I made it, and even inside I could not find his office. And right when I really thought, man, I'm really late for this meeting. This is a terrible first impression. I heard an excited voice. And this was in the morning, and in Brantford College it was very quiet. But it was not John's voice that I heard. What I heard was an excited voice on talk radio, sports talk radio. And someone was shouting that Peyton Manning is the most overrated quarterback in the history of the game, and his brother Eli's even more overrated. And so I followed the voice, and yes, that led me to John's office. And I have to say, even to this day, I think that John's office is the only academics office I've ever been in where sports talk radio is blaring. And so anyway, it really struck me that John would be honored to do this. Why would this legendary French historian be honored to sit on another oral exams committee, for an American historian of all things? And yet, since then, time and time again, I've asked John for many a favor, and time again, his reply has always been the same, that he would be honored to do this for me. And so, whenever a student asks me to advise them or to write for them or whatever, my reply is always the same. And I always say I'd be honored to do so, and every time I do, I think of John. And this gets back to something that several people have said. I think someone mentioned, maybe Rachel, you said paying it forward, and David Bell talked about how we try to take John's lessons and treat other people in this way. And so it makes sense to me. I understand that when I treat my students with dignity, and when I try to treat them like they're the next coming of John Merriman. In treating them with dignity, I'm honoring John by doing so, and that's where the honor is. And so it's an honor to be here so that we can honor John. Thank you very much.
So Paul Hanson is next from Butler University.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to stand up because I have props with me. I met John in 1979 in the archives in Limoges. My wife and I had been in France at that point for 8 months, the first 8 months in Caen, where we lived in a room in the upstairs of an old bourgeois house, so single room, two burner hot plate to cook on, no refrigerator. And we got to Limoges and found an apartment, actually a 2-room apartment with a full service kitchen. John was staying in the Hotel de Paris at the time, so we gradually started inviting John over to have dinner 3 times a week and shared meals. And eventually, about a month into our time there, John had a car, and we headed to Émoutier one Saturday and stopped for a picnic. So here you have me and John. Betsy took this photo. I had it blown up. They did a great job. As you can see, we've got plentiful food. We all know that John likes to eat. John, I'm sure, would insist, as he will no doubt at dinner tonight, that he hasn't changed at all. I obviously have, but I do still have that red hat. The only other thing I'd like to say about this is that you'll note that this was relatively early in our repast because the second bottle of wine hasn't been opened yet, but there were 2 there. So that was a wonderful couple of months in Limoges, working in the archives with John, sharing meals, and you know, it was summer, so it stayed light in Limoges until probably 10:30. And one night after dinner, John had gone off, I thought, back to the hotel, and Betsy and I went out for a walk, and before we know it, we run into John. You know, just out exploring the streets. One of which, of course, is the Rue de la Boucherie, which John wrote about early in his career, a very interesting part of Limoges and of Limoges' history. But that stayed with me, running into John on the street at 10 o'clock at night. It taught me, I think, that doing French history is not just about getting into the archives. And of course, John is a master of the archives, all 95 of the departmental archives. But it's also about getting out onto the streets and experiencing France today in order to get some kind of handle on what France has been like in the past. So these past 40 years of friendship and collegiality have been wonderful for me as well. I'm not quite one of John's students, but he did read every chapter of my dissertation when I got back to Berkeley, for which I was enormously grateful. So, John, it's wonderful to be here with you today.
Next up, we have Charles Keith from Michigan State.
Thank you. I'll stand too, if that's okay. So many years ago, the great Roger Chartier spent a year in residence at Yale. And he was living in a small apartment, maybe even 2 rooms in Brantford, where John was, of course, master. So when spring break came around, John, as he obviously would, offered Chartier the use of the master's house when he, Carol, and the kids were in Balazuc. So on the first night of Chartier's stay, he had a problem with the alarm system. He couldn't figure out how to turn it off. And the Yale police showed up. So Chartier's English was not particularly good to begin with, and he was quite flustered in the situation. So the only thing he could muster in the face of the police officers was, "I am Chartier, friend of Merriman." Right. So it has been one of the great fortunes of my life to be like Chartier, a friend of Merriman. And like all of us here, I could talk for an hour about this, but I only have 4 minutes, so I'll try to make 2 stories do the trick. One is from the AHA, which is a conference that John hates to go to. This just happened to be one of those years when some duty was calling and he had to be there. So he and I was still a graduate student, he and I and a few other graduate students were hanging out in the lobby with some wine to ease the pain of the event. When a senior figure in the field walked by, and I've checked and that person is not here this weekend, and said, "Oh, here is John with some of his acolytes." And John looked up surprised and just said, "Well, no, these are my friends." And for me, you know, this passing comment just captures a lot about what makes him such a great friend. The most obvious, which several people have talked about, is just his congenital aversion to hierarchy of any kind. And when I first met him, yeah, this is you know, very atypical of Yale, as David Bell mentioned. When I first met him, it really took me a while to get that, unlike some of the other senior faculty, when he said, "Call me John," he really meant it. He just does not like to be called Professor Merriman. And it's more than just the formalities, of course. From the very moment I met him, he always treated me not as an apprentice, but as an intellectual equal. It's only possible for John to have this kind of relationship with people like me because he is so very humble about himself. And I can see how he's equally moved and embarrassed listening to us all talk about him, as he is always in these kinds of situations. His humility is, of course, so evident in how he thinks about the past. His DNA as an historian is trying to understand people, and usually les petits gens, right? And he treats people in the past and people in his own life with exactly the same kind of empathy and decency. His humility makes him also very naturally open-minded, both intellectually and as a human being. If you know John, you know that his closest friends are from all walks of life. And his students are all from all walks of French history, and sometimes not even French history. I'm one of his many students whose interests in France pulled me very far outside of the hexagon, and in my case and in other cases outside of Europe entirely, and there are a couple of people in this room who fall into that category. I'm sure I'm not the only one of us in this room who has received a series of comments from John on written work they're always prefaced by, well, I don't know anything about this, but, and then of course they're followed by incredibly insightful and supportive comments. Since I met John, and it's been about 20 years now, he's given me the foundation to become an historian, the confidence I needed to go my own way as an historian, unflagging support, regardless of how far I got from 19th century French history, and by this time I've gotten quite far indeed from that, and most importantly, a model for how to be a citizen and a human being in the academy. What else could you ask for from a friend? Well, it doesn't hurt when your friends are also a hell of a lot of fun to hang out with, and that brings me to my other story. So years ago, when I was finishing up my dissertation research in Paris, my birthday came around. So I invited some other PhD students that I'd met, French and American, to a little soirée at my tiny little apartment, very deep in the 13e arrondissement. So it just so happened that John was in Paris at the time, so of course I invited him too. The other guests were a little surprised and a little intimidated to hear that Monsieur le Directeur de Thèse would be showing up. They really didn't know what to expect. Then John showed up, leather jacket, t-shirt, ripped jeans. Salut tout le monde, tu vas bien? Hey, put on some Rolling Stones. The party lasted a couple hours later than it would have, of course, if he hadn't been there. We definitely drank a few more bottles of wine than we would have if he hadn't been there. And at the end of the night, John hugged his new friends, and then he bummed a metro ticket to get home. And hearing Elinor's story, I wondered if he had crumpled it up and shot it into the basket. Right? Those people never knew what hit them. Ladies and gentlemen, our friend, John Merriman.
So next is Ken Loiselle from Trinity University.
Thanks, Rachel. A lot of what I've said, I wish I had a last name that was a little bit earlier in the alphabet, but a lot was already said. I find myself furiously scratching out things, but I'd just like to briefly talk about how I got my first real sense of John the person and John the scholar, even though it's obviously hard to disentangle the two. Back in 2002, I, along with some in this very room, was enrolled in a seminar on London and Paris being taught by John and Jay Winter. Immediately what struck me was John's terrific and self-deprecating sense of humor that lifted our class well above the humdrum routines of graduate seminars. Read, discuss, critique, repeat, right? For example, he reminded the class almost every week for nearly a month that he didn't care very much for the very long book, weighing in at over 1,000 pages, that Jay Winter had assigned, Charles Dickens' 1848 serial novel, Dombey and Son. Whenever Jay would begin to talk about the book, John would get restless, lean back in his chair, and loudly confer a new title to the book, Dummy and Son. This certainly made me feel less guilty about not having been able to plow through the entire text myself, and along with his humorous and sometimes hilarious interjections throughout the semester, which were, of course, full of Gallicisms and argot, which produced baffling or blankly uncomprehending faces amongst the non-French historians in the room, John was always able to lighten the mood and ultimately make for a really great semester. As for John the scholar, I began reading his work during a reading seminar when I wrote a historiographical essay in 1848. And it's here that I first encountered The Agony of the Republic, which has already been mentioned, and saw John's singular eye for the life of the laboring poor and rural peasantry who became deeply engaged with the political struggle that the February Revolution had initiated. In this way, John's work, as others have already mentioned, reminded me a bit of that of Richard Cobb, who was also fascinated in the trajectories of extraordinary, ordinary people during times of great turbulence. However, unlike Cobb, who tended, especially in his later writings, to divorce the colorful individual lives and experiences he so vividly brought to life in his pages from any broader political or social developments, John's work has consistently, as has been already mentioned, sought to draw attention to the dynamic between ordinary people and major historical forces, whether it was through the lens of governmental repression, urbanization, or major political upheaval. And it's this focus on the interplay between the very small, whether it was an industrial Faubourg in the west of France in 1849, or the young anarchist Émile Henry in 1894, and the very large storylines of history, along with John's constant reminder that the study of metropolitan France is really a comparative history of the provinces, of which Paris is one among many, that has probably most heavily influenced my own work. So John has been my dissertation advisor, a professional mentor, and now a good friend. And I've always and will always be indebted to his sociologically informed variant of microhistory, his goût des archives, and most importantly, his ready-made David Lodge-esque arsenal of hilarious stories about unexpected turns in the archives, academic life, time in Balazouk, and the many students, colleagues, and friends that have been fortunate enough to have John enrich their lives. Thanks.